And Trip, floor is yours.
Thank you, Kevin. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. So good morning, good afternoon, whichever the case may be. Glad y'all are here taking part in this webinar. We do want to start off kind of providing a little bit of historical background with the certification, why certification is important, and how the GISP came to be what it is now. And that's what we're going to really focus on in this part of the webinar. So why do we have certification? Where did it come from? What's the purpose of it? Well, for those of us that have been around in the industry for a long time, and I've been involved in the geospatial industry for well over 20 years now, we've always had issues working with other members of our profession, right? There's always been questions of whether GIS is truly a profession, what is our standing when we're working with engineers, surveyors, planners, and so on. And so part of the reason we developed a GIS certification, a professional level certification, was to really advance GIS forward as a true profession, to try to put us on par with the others that we work with, those engineers, surveyors, attorneys, doctors, nurses, all those other types of people that we work with. We wanted to make sure we were at the same level when we were sitting at the table, providing our input, our advice, presenting our analysis on things. The other part we were looking for with this is to support the community as a whole. A lot of people get hired into positions within GIS by others that don't have any idea what it is. You know, they can barely spell it, right? So having this certification helps those that aren't within our community understand or better sort out the true professionals from those that may just be users, make them better understand what qualifications they need to be looking for and those kind of things. So that certification helps that, because a lot of those HR folks just don't get it. We also want to ensure that those working in the field are doing so in a way that promotes the profession in a positive manner through ethics, certain levels of experience, certain levels of education, and they help continue to grow the community with professional contributions, right? Again, that's all part of being a profession. We also want you to be able to prove and document the great work you do. All the analysis, the map making, the data sets you're building, the applications, and then be recognized for that. So you can submit it to win a possible ESIG award from URISA, or one of the multiple awards that Esri gives out, or even something within your own local community. But by having that documentation of the achievements makes that possible. And then hopefully increase the earning potential of those within the industry by having a credential that you can go to your higher up, say, look, I earned this. This isn't something that you just get given. It takes time, experience, education, and all that in order to be awarded this certification. And that's really, the meat and the potatoes for the average person of why you want to do that. And we see that bearing out. The recent URISA salary survey that was conducted last year, and the final results should be published here very soon, but the initial results show that on average, a GISP makes more than $10,000 over a non-GISP. And that's held true for the last couple of salary surveys that URISA has done. So we see that this is a way of promoting both individual growth as well as community professional growth within not just our industry, but within the community as a whole, the whole area that we're working on. To do that, one of the things we did have to establish was, is GIS truly a profession? Because there is arguments by some, and to some extent I can see where they're coming from, that GIS is just a tool. And for some that is true. If you're a professional planner, you may just use a part of GIS to do your professional planning work. And for that, yes, it's a tool. But for those of us that really focus on the growth of that technology by building the data sets, building the applications, looking at the algorithms, updating that kind of technology, integrating new technologies in with it, it's a whole lot more than a tool. And so that's what we're talking about, is how do we define that as a profession? And I looked at a bunch of different definitions for what a profession was, and it, being paid to do one's work through requiring prolonged training and formal qualifications and so on. All of those things equal a profession. And when you boil it down to it, these are the components that really define a profession. Specialized knowledge and skills, right? Something that not everybody has. Formal education programs, degree programs, bachelor's, master's, PhD, certificates, all of those. Practicing professionals have responsibility and authority, that ability to make the choice. Do I do this or do I not? And if I do it, then I am responsible for the work I do. And that's usually through definitions and rules of conduct and codes of ethics, right? Licensure and certification, a big requirement for a profession, some sort of apprenticeship period before you're able to consider yourself to be at the professional level. The code of ethics to back up that responsibility and authority, a professional culture, right? Having that networking opportunities out there and what is expected, best practices, things like that. And then lastly, to be a professional, you have to have clients and not customers. And what that really means is, there's a saying, right? You go to the store, you try to buy something, and the saying is the customer is always right. Well, that's true if you're working in a retail industry, but if you're working in a professional environment, your clients are paying for your professional opinion and experience to help guide them, right? So trying to teach them the right way, to tell them, no, that's not going to work. You really ought to try to do this. It accomplishes the same thing, but doing that kind of thing. It's not being that the customer is always right. It's guiding the client to their goals in a way that is backed up by the professional culture, the code of ethics, rules of conduct, and best practices, and all of those kind of things. So having those clients, not customers. I think we can now look at GIS at this stage of the game, and we've pretty much checked all of these requirements off to be able to establish we are indeed a profession. And again, kind of in that middle is that requirement for licensure or certification, which does bring me to a common misconception. What is the difference between certification, licensure, and a certificate? Because I get this all the time. Oh yeah, I'm certified. I got my GIS certificate from so-and-so. Or I've got my bachelor's degree from so-and-so in GIS and whatnot. All of that is different, right? So certification is a voluntary process you go through that establishes a certain level of skills, knowledge, experience, and the way we prove that, okay? So it's not a legal requirement in most cases. It's something that your profession adopts as a requirement to get to certain levels within the industry, or as something you should hope to achieve to get to certain levels in there. Licensure is a legal requirement. This is legislative action that establishes the license, defines all of the requirements for getting the license, practicing under that license, and even losing the license. Okay? We see this with engineers, surveyors, doctors, lawyers. All of those people have licenses to operate. And here in the U.S., that's usually on a state-by-state basis. Right? So if you're licensed in the state of Georgia, where I'm at, that doesn't mean you can go practice in the state of Alabama or in North Dakota or Alaska. You're licensed to that state to do that function. And again, all that's defined under legislative action. Right? Lastly is a certificate. That just means you've completed some course of study. And that course of study could be a 4-year degree program, or it could be a 2-year program, or it could be you completed an 8-hour workshop and you get a certificate. That's all that means. right? So you can be certified but not licensed, licensed but not certified, licensed and certified, or you could have all three. But just because you have a certificate doesn't mean you're certified or licensed. I mean, you could have a license, but that doesn't mean you're certified. Okay? So these are very different terms, and we want to make sure everybody understands what we're talking about, because we're talking certification. That's what GISP is. It's a certification. Okay? So how did we get here? Where did the GISP come from? This is not something that evolved out of thin air. There has been a lot of thought put into this, and it goes back, well, at least to the 1990s, if not earlier than that. But in 1990s, ERISA really said, we need to move forward with this idea. We need a certification if we're going to continue on and claim that we're a profession within GIS. And so they started doing some feasibility work in the 1990s and formed a committee in 1997 that really started laying out what became, or what has become, the GISP certification. So they met, they had a lot of discussion, what should the requirements be, and all that. And at the time, there really wasn't a lot of guidance as to what does it take to build a certification. So they were looking at some of the other things done by ASPRS, and they were looking at some of the other technology certifications from Microsoft and so on. Is sort of a guide, but there was nothing that really defined how do you create a certification. But at about the same time, that was starting to change. We had NCCA and ICE, so the National Commission for Certifying Agencies and the Institute for Credentialing Excellence, getting started on what does it take to be a certification? What should a certification contain? How do you go about building one? Also around the same time frame, ANSI and ISO was starting to do the same process on helping to define that. But that was all happening outside of the GISP. In 2001, the ERISA committee came up with a plan for the GISP and did a certification program. And I think it was 2003, we had our first GISPs in a pilot program that was here in the state of Georgia, where ERISA worked with the Georgia ERISA chapter, and we had our first GISPs. ERISA, recognizing that this was bigger than itself, that this is really something to benefit the entire community, realized that it was probably in our interest, meaning the community's interest, to not just keep it as ERISA. Let's not just hold on and make this the ERISA certification. We need to put this out to the whole community. And they formed GISCI as a whole separate organization and turned the management of that certification over to GISCI. So contrary to what I've heard, this is GISP, yes, it was built originally by ERISA, but it's not a ERISA certification. Not solely. Yes, ERISA is still involved in it, but this is an industry standard certification, not just ERISA's certification. I think that's an important distinction, is that ERISA gave this up for the betterment of the community. And since then, GISCI has been managing the credential, following it through, and continuing to build on it. Recognizing the work that was done by NCAA, ICE, ISO, and ANSI on how these things should be done, best practices, as it were, for certification. In 2011, 2012, they started looking at those and trying to see how they could make GISP match up to those practices, with the ultimate goal of seeking accreditation for the certification. And so that led into a reworking of the GISP and trying to follow that, which really is a multi-step process now, right? So you go out and you perform a job analysis. What are the tasks that are required for that particular certification, and what are the knowledge areas out there? And they're two separate things. We look at knowledge areas, and then we look at tasks out there through various methods of surveys and DACOMs and things of that nature. Then we bring those back in and link the task up with the proper knowledge areas to validate both of those, right? To see what is the majority there, not just somebody that does parcel maintenance or somebody that just does routing analysis or somebody that just does addressing, but what is a whole, what are we doing? So they validate that through linking the task to the knowledge areas, the KSAs. And from there, you start assessing that out and building in your certification. So what are your assessment instruments going to be? That could be an exam, it can be a portfolio, it can be a combination of things. What reference materials are there for folks to reference for those, and then a validation of that assessment instrument that has to keep going. That's an ongoing process. You're always assessing those instruments, the portfolio and the exam, which is what we use for GISP, and continuing to build and update that. So why did they put the exam? Originally, GISP didn't have an exam. It was just a portfolio. So why did they add one in back in 2015? Well, part of it was to strengthen the GISP certification. That was one of the comments that we would see from the industry time and time again was, why don't we have an exam? We're going to get an exam. This would mean more if we had an exam. So, and that matched back with what the ISO, ANSI, those other organizations that laid out the practices for developing a certification, recommended that you had that as part of your certification. We also wanted to make sure that the knowledge area is aligned with the job analysis, and the exam helped do that. We could look at what the exam was testing on and look at the results of the exam, the results of passing, failing, and those kind of things, and make sure that we were in line with what the job analysis it told us. It also then helps us validate our portfolio. Are we looking at the right things? Are the people that are passing the exams having the experience to match it? Again, it's just a way of validating the other part, and those two work together. And then lastly, working towards that accreditation that GISCI is working on for the GISP to get accredited with one or more of those bodies that we were talking about earlier. And the same goes here with the portfolio, right? It does provide us proof of your experience, right? That you've worked in the field for the required amount of time, that you do have the educational requirement met, and that you are contributing to the profession, right? And that's part of being a professional, giving back to the community. That's why attorneys and doctors do pro bono work, right? Same thing here with us. We want to do that. Again, to align and make sure that our portfolio matches with the job analysis and matches back with the exam, so that there are, again, two tools for validating each other to make sure we're staying on track and following the certification best practices laid out by those other organizations. And again, heading towards that accreditation moving forward. So the future that GISCI sees for the GISP certification is, again, they're working towards accreditation, trying to get it accredited by one or more of those bodies, continuing to add value to the certification, right? If it stays stagnant, we don't update it, don't change, then it's going to lose value. So we want to keep working at improving that certification by getting it accredited, keeping the exam current, reviewing and updating the KSAs associated with all of this and whatnot. So they can continue to working on that. And then a little bit further down the road, adding additional certifications. There has been some talk about a GIS management certification, maybe a GIS technician certification, but again, being able to follow the same process that we now know, it's part of that best practice. So we want to keep doing that. So the question then becomes, why do you want to certify? What's the benefit to you? Every year for the last 3 or 4, no, I guess 4, almost 5 years now, I've done a GIS certification survey where I go out to the industry through various channels, listservs, social media and whatnot, and ask questions, is it being accepted by the industry? So Last year, I got over 2,700 responses. 88% said GIS was their primary job. Almost 70% had over 10 years of experience within the field. And this number has gone up steadily since I first started doing it. It was up by 177 from the previous year. Okay. The respondents, I got people from all over the place: private companies, governments, nonprofits, education, utilities, tribal councils, healthcare industry, regional uh, uh, planning groups, and so on. So a pretty wide breadth of respondents here. And it wasn't just here in the U.S. Yes, the majority were here from the U.S., but also have people from Canada, India, Australia, Spain, South Africa, and so on. So good breadth of people. So one of the questions that I used to ask, and I've stopped asking this, but what certifications do people know about that are related to GIS? And it's pretty much a landslide. The GISP and the Esri technical certifications are the most well-known, which is kind of interesting because these others, certified GIS, LIS technologists from ASPRS, CMS, CP, also from ASPRS, have all been around a lot longer than GISP. Yet they're, by and large, not as well known as the GISP and Esri certifications within the GIS field. So that was kind of interesting. Some of those that have been around longer aren't as well known as the newer ones, right? So next question is, do you believe certification benefits GIS professionals and users? And the overwhelming majority say yes. So the community does believe in certification, and that in the long run, it does benefit those of us within the profession and those that use the things we create as well. So you can see that, and that's staying pretty steady up there. So a good majority think this is a good thing that we do. Which type of certification do you believe has the most value? So that's professional versus technical certification. So professional certification is the GISP, which has time, experience requirements, educational requirements, and all that, whereas technical certifications are, do you know how to use a certain set of software from Esri or Autodesk or whatnot? We see that about a third think that the professional certification has the most value, but interestingly enough, about the same value, 38%, believe you should have both. And I'd have to say I'm kind of in agreement with that. The technical certification shows you know how to use a specific software platform, a technology stack. And then the professional certification shows that you have a deeper understanding, that you understand what the buttons do. So you can start out in the beginning of your career, get the technical certs, get in, start to get the experience, and then move into the professional certification. Okay. Do you think certification exams I'm sorry, let me start over. Do you think the exam adds credibility to the GISP? Because this was just added in 2015. So the exam is still very new to the certification. And the majority, almost 60%, say it absolutely does in there. Only 18% say it doesn't, and a quarter are just not sure, which is down a good bit. So most people think the addition of the exam was a good thing. Okay. So does your organization require GIS certification for any job positions? This number has been slowly increasing. You can see that last year, 9% of the respondents said it did. 80%, 87% said no, and 4% had no idea. One thing, if you read the comments, I did find is that the education requirement, either for a bachelor's, master's, or higher degree, is the most popular requirement. That's pretty standard. What we have found is that this certification is considered a plus over those that don't. You can see that 44% of those that responded say having it was a bonus over those that didn't when interviewing or looking to hire somebody for a GIS-related position there. So it will give you that bump if all other things are equal there. Okay. Does your organization offer a bonus or pay raise if you get the GIS or get a GIS certification? That's not just the GISP, but any of them. 7%, which has been pretty stagnant for the last 2 years, say yes. The majority say no, but a third-ish of them will, at least their employer will pay for it if they get it, which is a good thing. I do know that I have seen this kind of on the rise as it's getting more incorporated into job requirements. Somebody, I think Lisa sent me and Kevin email earlier that said there's some federal job descriptions that actually require the GISP in order to get to those higher level positions with the federal government. I know Florence County, South Carolina will give you an extra $2,000 a year if you get your GISP. So there are some out there that do give you a bonus, or at least a pay raise. That's good. When hiring new staff, does your organization pay a higher salary for those with the certification? Only 11% say yes. 61% say no, and 30% roughly said they weren't sure. So not necessarily higher, but that kind of contradicts what the salary survey says. So I'm not quite sure why that is the case, but again, doesn't look like it hurts to have it. And then this I did for my perspective, being a consultant, is does your organization encourage GISPs to be included on teams for GIS services if they're not required? And so about half said no, 17% said sure, and a quarter there weren't really sure whether that was the case or not. I know I have seen several RFPs out, and I know that number keeps going up, where they do say GISP or other certification is preferred. I actually saw one from Tennessee DOT that not only required GISPs be on the team, they had specific Esri certifications they were looking at to be on the team for the project as well. So that was one of the more specific ones I've seen, and that was a year or two ago that I saw that. So that was kind of interesting. Okay. So my overall conclusions with regard to does it have benefit is that most of us do think there is a benefit to it, but most of the employers haven't fully embraced the certification to a large extent. I have some ideas as to why I think that's the case, but I think part of it's we don't do a very good job of selling it to the hiring people that write the job descriptions. We don't go down to HR and explain that there are these certifications and why they have some value and how they could help with hiring, things like that, but do that. We do, with our own community, believe that professional certification is slightly valued higher than just technical, but again, the majority believe that having both is the best benefit there. And that we see education has still more value right now over certification. And I think those two should be hand in hand, right? That you should have the education to back up the certification, and the certification helps reinforce you have the education. So I think those two really ought to be working together as opposed to separate considerations there. And that we see a large confusion between those three words, certification, licensure, and a certificate. That people think because they have a degree or a certificate, they're certified, or because they have a license that they're certified, or because they're certified, they have a license. And it's just a lot. You just read through the comments in the survey and you just see that. A lot of confusion over those words. And then lastly, younger people with less experience are more accepting of certification than those of us that are old timers in the industry that for some reason seem, based on the comments I've read, to feel somewhat threatened by certification. That we don't like people telling us what we know. We know what we know. We've been doing it for so long that we don't need somebody to validate our abilities. And I kind of get that. The younger folks coming up seem to look at it as a great way to enhance their resume, a way to show their skills and abilities being either as good, on par, maybe even better than those that have been around for a longer time. So to help them get those jobs, get their foot in the door. So I think we see that. Okay. So I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, Kevin.
We've got time for a question or two, Trip. Wendy, is there anything in the chat room that Trip can answer? Should we move to the next one?
Nothing on the chat room at the moment.
All right, Trip, we're perfectly on schedule then. So if you want to switch to your next slide deck, by all means.
Okie doke. And if something does come up between now and later, here is the contact information for myself, Rebecca Summers, who has been the project lead for the exam development for GISP, and Bill Hodge, the executive director of the GISCI. So we're always happy to answer questions. So we'll go ahead and switch out of that and go into the next part.
For those of you that joined a couple of minutes late, you do have an opportunity to submit questions as we're proceeding through the webinar this afternoon, and the same will be true tomorrow. Please do that via the chat room. Our colleague Wendy is watching that, and at the end of each one of our components in the webinar, we'll attempt to address those questions as best we can. Trip?
Okay, good. Y'all are going to get really tired of hearing my voice today because I'm doing a lot of this. So what we'll go ahead and now that we have the history behind the certification, we're going to go over the certification itself. What are the basic requirements to earn your GISP? And I'll give you a couple of suggested tips on getting prepared at a base level for all this. So again, as Kevin said, if you have any questions, type them in the chat, and we'll be happy to answer those towards the end of this section. So when we're looking at certification, as I alluded to in the previous section, is there different types. We have the technology certifications that would be vendor-based, software-specific, so the ones from Esri, like the Desktop Associate or Desktop Professional, Microsoft, being a Microsoft certified DBA and so on, Autodesk certifications. I understand there's some certifications for QGIS that may be under development, but all of those are based on a specific technology stack, meaning you know how to use that software. You know which buttons to mash. You may not know exactly how those buttons work or what happens in the background as it does its thing, but you know which ones you need to press and where they're at and what order to use them and all that kind of stuff. The other is our professional-based certifications. These are a little bit higher level. They're not built on any sort of specific technology. They typically have a requirement that you have worked in the field for a certain amount of time, an apprenticeship period. You have to have certain levels of education, and you have, which then mean you understand the theory behind what the buttons in the other part do. And then you're giving back to the profession in some form or fashion. And we see this through GISCI with the GISP, ASPRS with their multiple certifications, CMS and CP and so on, IAAO in their professional certifications for appraisers and assessors. Those are just a few examples of professional based. We have AICP from APA for planners, CFM for floodplain managers, and so on. These are all professional-based certifications, okay? And that's what GISP is. The difference here is that with professional-based, as I was saying, you usually have to have a minimum time requirement. You have had to have worked in the field a certain amount of time. You don't just come out of college and become certified, right? You have to be within that field working professionally a typical time, and 4 years is a pretty typical requirement for that. Some, depending on your education, maybe more, maybe less, but basically 4 years is a fairly common requirement. It also shows proof of overall knowledge and theory behind the concepts are those KSAs that are identified with that certification, with that profession. Most of these do include an exam as a way to prove that knowledge in there. Portfolios to show your time requirement, education requirements, and all that. They normally have a code of ethics and rules of behavior, something that states, how you should run your decision-making processes as you're going through deciding, should I do this, not do that. Helps guide what you can do, can't do, kind of thing in there. And then a requirement for continuing education, right? So you're never resting on your laurels. You're always looking at what is the new thing coming down the block. What am I needing to learn to keep my skills, sharp, so I'm not stuck in that rut that happens. And especially in our profession with technology constantly changing, that's a very critical part of what's going on. And what this does is it helps show a high level of overall knowledge and experience within the profession, shows dedication to the profession. Somebody that's gone out and gotten their GISP, they're not just in it for the 8 to 5. They're really trying to grow themselves in the profession to make it better for all of us, right? And then that also then makes you a leader in the field, because you're not just coming in, punching the clock. You're trying to show, that you believe that this is beneficial stuff, that you want to grow yourself and the profession and take it to the next level, to keep pushing the envelope, as it were, right? So these are things that all professional-based certifications do, whether it's GISP or CMS or AICP or CFM or any of these others that we've talked about, okay? Whoops, wrong way, right? So we already talked about why we do this, so I'm not going to really go into this in great detail, but do want to point out a couple things. One, that establish of ethics in there is a big part. It helps guide us on what we can do and can't do, right? So it gives us guidance on when we should tell somebody no. So that if somebody were to come in and tell you to alter the voting district boundaries because they wanted some subdivision into their district because they had some friends that live there, you can't do that. And the Code of Ethics helps do that. So it helps advance us as a profession in that regard, right? So we want to make sure we're doing that, okay? So now let's talk specifically about the GISP, right? So the GISP, which stands for GIS Certified Professional, is managed by the GIS Certification Institute, or their website, www.gisci.org. Okay? That's all. That's all they do. They manage the GISP. They set the requirements for the GISP, what it takes to renew, the exam. They handle all of that. Okay? Now, it was an outgrowth of ERISA. That ERISA built the original requirements for the GISP. But in 2004, ERISA decided that, again, as I mentioned, for the betterment of the community, that we needed to form a separate group, the GISCI, in order to manage that credential, and invited other organizations to join the GISCI. The idea here was that if ERISA created their own, then some of these other organizations that are now members of GISCI might also do the same. And then we have conflicting credentials. And people start to get confused on, well, what does this one mean? What's the difference and all that? So this made it, it unified the industry under one primary professional certification, so that it didn't just seem to be a ERISA thing, right? So the current members of GISCI include these organizations. ERISA, obviously a founding member. We've got the Association of American Geographers, the University Consortium of Geographic Information Science, the Geospatial Information and Technology Association, the National States Geographic Information Council, or NSGIC. All of these are part of the GISCI. All of these organizations have board members that guide the direction of the certification. All of them have equal input into what happens with the credential. It's not just ERISA directing it. Everybody has an equal voice at the table through GISCI on the development and continued growth of GISP. So, how do I get my GISP? What's the process? Okay, this is kind of where it starts to get confusing, right? How do I become one? Well, you have to meet certain requirements, right? So there's a 4-year requirement. You have to take an exam. You have to complete the portfolio and all that. When can you get started on this process? Well, anytime. You can start filling out the online application right this very minute. Okay. That doesn't require you to pay any money. That doesn't require the clock to start. That doesn't require you to do anything but go online, create an account through the GISCI website, and start filling in the form, the online form that they have. Okay. Do that anytime. When things start to happen is when you start getting ready to either submit your portfolio or actively take the exam. Okay. When you decide you're ready to do one of those two things, that's when the process really gets started. That's when that 6-year clock starts to tick. So what we expect is that those young professionals coming out of school, as they're getting their degrees, are probably going to want to take the exam first because they have all that knowledge, the theory, still in their head. So they would come in, pay the $100 application fee, and register to take the exam, which is $250. The minute they do that, that 6-year window starts. They have 6 years from that point to complete all the requirements for certification. Pardon me, got pollen down here big time. Those of us that have been around a little bit longer might do it differently. We may decide we want to do our portfolio first because we have more than enough years of experience and professional, all that stuff. So we may go ahead and submit our application, which is $100, plus our portfolio, which is another $100, get that done, and then we'll take the exam a little bit later. So that $250 fee comes later. But the minute we submit the application and submit the portfolio for review, that starts that 6-year clock for us going that route. Can you do both at the same time? Absolutely. If you think you are ready to pass the exam and your portfolio is complete, then you can do all of this in one fell swoop. Submit to do all of it if you want to. The key is once you do that application and application fee part, that starts the 6-year clock. You have 6 total years from the time you do that to complete the entire process, right? So to complete the portfolio and pass the exam to get your GISP. Once you've gotten the GISP, then you have to renew it every 3 years, which means you have to submit the requirements for renewal, right? The education you've received, experience, and contributions you've done. And you'll pay an annual renewal fee of $95 every year to keep your certification current. I believe the GICI will allow you to go ahead and pay for all 3 years in advance if you have an employer that is willing to do that for you. But like I said, every year, once you get your certification, you'll be paying $95 a year to keep it current. So what are the total requirements for the GISP? 4 years of full-time equivalency. So if you work part-time, it may take longer than 4 years. So if for 1 year you work for half of your time, right, that's only 50% of that 1 year. So it would require, 4.5 years to do that or something like that. So it's 4 years of full-time equivalency working in the field of GIS, focused on GIS. Okay, so that's the experience time requirement. Then for the portfolio, you've got to get 150 points in one of three areas: education, experience, and professional contributions. So those will be divided. And we'll talk about each one of those in greater detail in future or later presentations today. You also have to agree to follow the Code of Ethics and Rules of Conduct for GISP. That's a very important part, and that's if you get caught breaking those, you can lose your certification, right? Then you have to pass the exam, and then renew every 3 years. And I see some questions flying into the chat. So let's talk about the portfolio a little bit. It can now be done entirely online. So you don't have to do what some of us old timers did, which was have to keep a folder that was 5 inches thick with our application, all our documentation. You can go to the GISCI website, gisci.org. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you've got to register or log in. So if you're brand new, you go register, create your account. If you're already created your account, you go to log in. And from there, you can start filling in your application. Okay? So I mentioned that there was 150 points in 3 categories: in education, professional experience, contributions. At education, you have to have a minimum of 30 points. That's the minimum. Okay. Professional experience, a minimum of 60 points. And professional contributions, a minimum of 8 points. At least 52 flex points that you can distribute between those 3 categories however you see fit. Okay. Now, the one thing I will add is that for the sake of the portfolio, don't just limit yourself to 150 points. Always give yourself some wiggle room, because the review of the portfolio is still somewhat subjective, and the reviewers may not agree with everything you're claiming points for. So I would encourage you to have, 170, 180 points, if possible, when you go to submit it. That just gives you some wiggle room in there in case somebody disagrees with that. On the opposite side, there is no need to submit 300 points, right? Because as reviewers going through that, and I've reviewed many applications as part of the application review committee. When you reach the minimum, when you've reached the total 150 points and exceeded the minimums and all the others, we stop. We're not going to go through all 300 points you've claimed, because, well, we have a life. And so there's no need to go overboard. There is no, as I tell folks, there's no super GISP for having the most points, right? It's all the same with that. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the exam. It is offered at PSI testing centers. So that is a company that provides computer test centers for multiple certifications. It's not just GISP. They do Microsoft exams there, CompTIA exams, all these other certification exams there. So you can go take, they have centers worldwide, because GISP is not just a US-centric or North American-centric certification. It is international. When you go to take the exam, yes, it's computer-based, but there is no GIS software on the test computer. So don't think that you'll just be able to go in and open up QGIS or ArcMap and figure out how to do something, right? Because first off, the test for GISP is not platform specific, so it doesn't matter. And you're not going to be able to go to Google or any of that. It's locked down, so the only thing you can access is the exam itself. So keep that in mind. When you show up, you will need 2 forms of ID, one government-issued ID, and then some sort of credit card, debit card, gym membership card, some other thing to, again, prove you are who you say you are. When you go and take the test, you're not allowed to take any technology into the testing room with you. No computers, cell phones, tablets, earbuds, anything, iPads, iPhone, whatever. None of that can go in with you. The only thing you can bring in is yourself. They will provide you with some form of scratch paper to take notes on. Okay, So you're not even allowed to bring in a notepad at all. So the only thing that goes in the room is yourself. So keep that in mind. Okay. Here's some questions. So like, how many questions are on the exam? It varies from with each offering. So it's between 175 to 195. One thing to remember is that when you take the exam, only 100 of the questions that you take are actually scored. You will not know which ones are scored and which ones aren't. The reason you have more questions than those that are scored is because they're also vetting new questions for future exams. So they need to, they're trying to see how those work out. Again, you'll never know which ones are the scored ones and which ones aren't. So you should treat every one as a scored question. Question types, multiple choice, multiple answer, potentially true or false. I think the most recent exams have been all multiple choice and multiple answer. So multiple choice is your standard, pick the right answer from A, B, C, or D. Multiple answer is those select all that apply, right? A, B, C, D, or E, and it could be one, it could be all, it could be two. With the GISP, it does not tell you how many to select, or that's what I understand. Is it, it says select all that apply. You have to determine how many you need to pick with that. The pass score is a 75%. I understand that all questions are treated equally. They don't weight any of the questions based on the knowledge level or anything like that. They're all considered equally with scoring that. And you have basically 4 hours to complete the exam in there. Okay. And remember, it's not vendor specific. They're not going to be asking you questions about how to do something in ArcMap or QGIS or Map3D or Intergraph or any of the other things. It's all going to be just basic general knowledge. Okay. So how do they deal with the exam? It's offered twice a year, usually once in the winter and then once in the summer. I think they have one coming up in June, July this year. And GISCI is the one that schedules those dates, and they'll coordinate with PSI to make sure it's all into their system and ready to go. Okay. So make sure you check GISCI's website on when the window is to register for the exam. Usually they'll close that registration window 2 to 3 weeks before the actual exam date. So don't think you can go, oh, they're offering it today, I'm going to register. No, you can't do that. You have to register, in advance to take it. So when are you eligible to take the exam? You can take it whenever you want to. Right? If you think you're ready right now, go ahead and register to take it this summer and go for it. There is no requirement for you to have reached the 4 years of FTE. You do not have to have completed your application, your portfolio to take the exam. You can take it anytime you want to. Just remember, once you take the exam, that starts the 6-year clock. That if you take the exam and pass it, then you must complete the portfolio within that 6-year period, which means that's when you have to complete the 4-year FTE there, because you can't submit the portfolio until you've reached the 4-year FTE. And of course, you got to pay the fees, the $100 application fee and the $250 exam fee. And also, I should let folks know that the majority of that exam fee does not go to GISCI. Most of that goes to PSI. So that's not something GISCI is keeping. It's what they pay PSI for giving the exam. And that's true of the Esri exams as well, and the Microsoft exams and so on. That. Okay. So what is the exam based on? Well, if you go to the geospatial body of knowledge, you'll see they've broken down the categories into conceptual foundations, cartography and visualization, data design aspects and modeling, GIS analytical methods, data manipulation, and geospatial data. So data design aspects and modeling make up almost a third of the questions you'll see on the exam, or the pool of questions that was developed for the exam. And you see the rest of the percentage. I don't need to read that to you. But this all pulls from those areas as defined under the geospatial body of knowledge published by UCGIS and AAG there. And I believe there's a link to a PDF copy of that from the GISCI website under exam materials in there. So if you're not sure what makes up those, you can go look. Okay. Now, a couple of tips I'm going to give you for studying for the exam, and this is based on my experiences having taken more certification exams than I care to remember from Microsoft, Esri, CFM, and more. So just some things to remember, right? You will need to study for the exam. I don't care how long you've been doing GIS, with the possible exception of those in academia that maybe teach it and teach the theories behind it all the time. You will need to study, okay? Because people get in the field, they tend to specialize. They also get focused on one platform, and they kind of lose the theories and all that, the larger picture. So make sure you do study. You want to go and get that GIS&T body of knowledge I was telling you about and look at your experience and compare that to the knowledge areas. What are your weaknesses? What have you forgotten since you went to school? What did they not maybe cover as well in the program you were at? Whatever it is, right? Identify your weak areas and make sure you focus on those. Find recommended resources. The amount of resources for this continues to grow. This webinar is a good example of that. GISCI is putting out some more materials. There's a bunch of stuff on Reddit, right? Get any recommended resources you can find. And one of the things that I always encourage folks, because this is probably one of the biggest problems people have, is make sure you know the lingo. Look at the official definitions for terms, not how you use it in your workplace, not how you understand it. Make sure you know what the official definitions are for things. And make sure you're also not just focused on vendor-specific terms, right? So, like topology is a great example. First off, people often confuse topology with topography, right? There's a big difference between topology and topography. Topology is how features are modeled spatially. Topography is changes in elevation. Okay? The next confusion comes in with that, where they get focused on Esri's definition of topology with the use of geodatabase topologies and rules. Not every software that does topology implements the concept of that model of spatial relationships the same way. Not everybody has rules that you validate against. Some just go check connectivity or adjacency and then snap based on cluster. There's different ways that's done. So don't get focused on a vendor meaning of something as well. Think big picture. Think theory. Think above how you do it with a certain button, right? And again, make sure you know the terms in the meaning of those terms. Okay. There are some self-assessment tools. The Geotech Center has one that allows you to assess your knowledge and will tell you where you're weak. That's another great resource. Seek out some practice tests. These have been hard to find because GISCI has been very protective, and rightly so, of the exam, but they've actually released a practice exam that you can download and run through here. And again, kind of get used to how the questions are asked, how the answers are presented, what your weak areas might be, those things. If you know a couple of folks in your area that are looking to do the same thing, form a study group. The more diverse, the better, because like I said, the standard is that we focus on specific areas. We become planners, 911 experts, focus in epidemiology, environmental stuff, whatever. And this is a broad exam. It's about everything, right? So form a study group, help each other, meet up. Use flashcards. Those are great for terminology, making sure you know what that means. There, okay? And then seek out others who have taken the exam. Find out what their experience was like. Now, they're not going to be able to tell you specifics about the exam. Everyone who takes the exam has to agree to an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, so they can't specifically tell you the questions on the exam, or they're not supposed to anyway. but they can tell you what they did to study that worked, what they did to study that didn't work, vaguely what types of questions were in there on a general level, but they can help kind of get you pointed in the right direction. So make sure you seek those kind of people out there. Night before you take the exam, don't overcram. This is, most of us aren't in college anymore. So the idea of staying up all night and cramming is just not a good idea. Honestly, if you don't know the stuff the night before the exam, you probably don't know it. So make sure you get a good night's sleep. Okay? The other nice thing with this is, unlike college, you get to choose when you take the exam. When you go to sign up through PSI's site to schedule, you get to pick the time during that period. If you're a morning person, you're one of these people that wakes up ready to greet the day with exuberance and energy, then schedule it for the morning. If you're more like me that wakes up and goes, oh my God, where's my coffee? I'm going to wait to at least 10 o'clock before I schedule anything to make sure I've had that coffee, that I'm awake, my brain is functioning well. Obviously, there is, if you're more of a midnight person, well, I'm sorry, those test centers aren't usually open at that time. You might have to drive a couple of time zones over if you want to do it that way. But pick a part of the day that works best for you when you're scheduling this. Don't just settle, right? That's why you want to register early. Okay. As you're taking the exam, make sure you use all the time. There is no bonus for finishing first. Okay. I use a 3-pass method when I take these exams. I go through the entire exam, I go through all of it one time. Any of those that I know without a shadow of a doubt, I answer. Just answer, right? And don't overthink it. Just when you read the question, if you see the answer, that's probably the answer. If you start overthinking it, you're going to mess yourself up. But as you're doing that, note those that you have a general idea. It could be this one or that one, as well as I have no idea. And you're going to have questions that have no idea. And then go back the second pass, and all of those that you have a general idea, go ahead and answer those. A lot of times what you'll find as you go through you may find a question later that helps you answer an earlier question, right? That's the other advantage of this multiple pass, right? So answer all of those that you have a general idea about, and then on the third pass, answer any of those questions you have no idea, because from what I understand, any unanswered question is counted wrong. So, okay. Some exam tricks to watch out for. Look out for specific keywords: best, most, minimum, maximum. Anytime you see words like that, usually you'll find an answer. You find more than one answer that might work, but you have to figure out, well, which one is the best, or which one is the minimum level needed to do this, or which one's the max. So watch out for those keywords that will trip you up. Another common thing they like to do is they'll overload a question with a bunch of information. It'll be a scenario question, and they'll just put a bunch of superfluous stuff and bury the important stuff in the middle. So make sure you read the question thoroughly and have a good understanding of it, because if you skim it, you may get lost in the fluff and miss the key part, right? And they'll do that a lot, especially on scenario-based questions. Okay? And then make sure you have to eliminate what you know is wrong, right? If you know something is completely wrong, just go ahead and throw that out. Okay? And then that'll get you the right answers, or at least potentially right answers, a lot faster. Okay? So with that, I didn't have an ending slide on that one.
So Trip, we actually have had a tremendous number of really great questions drop into the chat. We're just a little bit behind time, but I've decided I'm going to relinquish 5 minutes of my allotted time, since I'm up next to my good friend from Georgia, and let Wendy maybe throw a few of those questions your way, and we'll try to get to all of them before the end of the webinar today or tomorrow. So Wendy?
Yes, Trip, somebody asked if you know if there's a licensure program in the works for GIS professionals in the future, or if GISP is going to morph into one.
There is no official move to set up a GIS license because that's done on a state-by-state level here in the U.S. I'm not sure about outside the U.S. Now, what has happened is some states have enacted surveyor licenses for GIS work. So, for example, South Carolina has a GIS surveyor's license that says to do certain things, mostly dealing with parcels and field data collection, requires you to have this license. But there is no move to establish a licensure for GIS because, again, that would take, here in the U.S., all 50 states. And that's why we support certification is a better track to licensure.
Great. Somebody else asked, if you keep it current, do you ever have to take the exam again? And I was able to answer that one. You only do have to take the exam once as long as you keep your certification current, correct?
That is correct. The idea is that you renew, which has a continuing education requirement to it, so that you're continuing to grow and expand your knowledge with new trends and new technologies. That's why you don't have to retake the exam. And that's typical of pretty much every other certification and even license out there.
Great. There were a few people who are concerned about the fact that some folks who were grandfathered in or who submitted their portfolio before the exam came into existence, they're concerned that some of those folks don't know as much about GIS as the people who are taking the exam. So is there ever going to be an exam for people that were grandfathered in?
That would be a question for Bill Hodge at GICI. I don't think there will be. From what I understand from Bill is that the exam is just another validation for the portfolio. It's testing against the same knowledge areas that the portfolio was built against, so they don't intend to do that from best of my knowledge, but that could be wrong. I do know that, as you mentioned, if you let your GISP lapse for over, I think it's over a year, then you do have to take the exam to re-earn your GISP. But as long as you stay current, I don't think they're ever going to have anybody do that. Of course, I also know that even with exams, I know like some engineers and surveyors and planners that are better than others. So I think that's just a kind of a nature of the beast.
Good point. Somebody let us know that the supplemental points section on the GISCI website had some links that were broken, so I have already let Bill Hodge know about that. Carrie asked if transcripts can now be unofficial instead of paying for an official copy, and I also got word from the GISCI administrator that you can now submit unofficial transcripts, which you can download as PDFs from your university or college. So that's good news for folks.
Mm-hmm.
Maya is stating, so the GISP costs $450 once, and then an additional $95 per year forever unless you let it lapse, correct? If I go through the effort of preparing for and passing the exam, I don't want to share the same designation with the people that scrambled and didn't want to take the exam before it was released. If pre-exam GISPs are grandfathered in forever, then there needs to be a separate designation. And that goes back to the earlier comment, which we will share with the GISCI board.
Yeah, absolutely. And as to the question about the money, yeah, once you get your certification, that first year that you get it, the first 12-month period is covered. You don't have to pay the $95 for that. But yeah, then the second year after that is $95. Third year after that is another $95. Then you have to also renew. And then, yes, it keeps going on after that, which is, again, is in line with all the other professional certifications out there.
Somebody else asked, if you don't pass the exam, can you have a redo? And you have to pay to take it again. Is there any limit on the number of times you can take it? And I, again, sent that off to to Katie for the official word from GISCI, and she said you can retake it and it will cost $250. If you take the exam back to back and fail both times, then you have to sit out for at least one exam offering. That was her response to that.
Yeah, and keeping in mind that $250 is for PSI to administer and offer the exam. That's not GISCI. That's a requirement of the test center.
And Kelly wanted to know, as you're taking the exam, can you go back and forth between the questions?
Yes.
All right. I think I got everybody.
Perfect. Well, let's take about a 5-minute, very short break. I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording during that time. For the rest of the afternoon, we're going to cover the education, the experience requirements, and the contributions to the profession components of the portfolio to get into a little more detail on how the points are designed, what you can do to achieve those points, and so forth. And I think there's going to be some valuable information for you to think about as we go through that. We aren't going to be getting into the exam itself, the content of today any further, but that is the entire topic of tomorrow's session from 1 to 4:30. So I encourage everyone to stay with us for the next few minutes, but we are going to take a very short 5-minute break and then we'll continue from that point. So I will pause the recording now. And all right, well, let's go ahead and move into the next section of our material this afternoon. Before we dig into this too far, I just want to set a little bit of a context. Originally, when the GISP requirements and submission process were put in place, as I think we all know at this point, the requirement was a portfolio. It was a set of documentation about your experience as a GIS professional. And the reality is the information in the portfolio is something that we really should all be keeping track of anyway. I confess I've been personally a GIS professional for well north of 2 decades now. Held many positions on different boards, given many different presentations, have attended lots of classes, have lots of credentials like my colleague Tripp, and yet, until I filled in the application, the portfolio for the GISP, I had not really tracked that documentation aspect. I simply did something, acknowledged that I had accomplished it, and that was the end of it for the most part. But I didn't keep track of the documentation that established the credibility for what I had done. So I think that even if your background is rich in GIS and in the related fields, if you're not already doing that, you're going to find the value of developing this portfolio content to extend beyond just the process of completing your GISP application. It will help you in job growth. It will remind you of what you have done, which, speaking from a personal perspective, was really quite an interesting experience to think back over those things. And it potentially will help you pursue additional employment advancement opportunities in the future. So I found the portfolio, and still do find the portfolio, to be something that I can leverage not only for my GISP work, but for other things. Think about it as the metadata of your life, the documentation that is the who, what, when, where, and why of you. So what we're going to do, again, over the remaining time together this afternoon, is get into the components of the portfolio of the application that you have to develop in addition to completing the GISP exam. And I do think, in my opinion at least, the portfolio is in many ways every bit as important as the exam, because the portfolio is the description of your experience. This is the reason that you cannot simply come out of college and get your GISP simply by completing the exam. The GIS professional is an individual that is a combination of knowledge and experience. And the portfolio is a critical component of that. And I'm confident that my colleagues presenting this afternoon concur with that assessment. So let's talk about the portfolio piece. Specific to education, you need as Tripp shared with you earlier today, a minimum of 30 different education points. And those points can be spread across or need to be spread across a combination of areas. Some of those points can come from education, some of them from formal course points, and then there are credential related points that you can pursue as well. Let's talk about the education points first. Now, not surprisingly, if you have a degree that is related to any discipline associated with pretty much anything, you're going to get credit for that. GIS coursework is required. We'll talk about that in a minute. But having a degree for which you do get points ranging from 5 all the way up to 25, depending on the level of that degree or certificate, is recognized as value. It acknowledges you as someone who has the ability to evaluate a situation and identify a solution to the problem. One of the things that a GIS professional is recognized as doing is not merely someone who can click a button and produce a map, but rather someone who can conceptualize a problem, identify a solution, and implement that solution. The more advanced your degree, the more training and education that you've had towards that end. An individual with a certificate has much less exposure to identifying original ideas and implementing those than someone with, say, a bachelor's, master's, or PhD, thus recognizing the differential in points that you can get for those different areas. For course points, any course that has GIS science, technology, or applications, any workshop, or any other formal documented educational activity is going to work in your favor. Now, there's some math involved here, and you can see the formulas are spread out for you on the screen. So you take your class credit hours, multiply it times the number of weeks, and divide it by a set value of 40, number of hours in a week, and that gives you your points. So, for example, and there is a recognition that there's different credit hours in different university courses, and different universities, for that matter, give different credit points for semester courses. But let's say, hypothetically, you have a 3 credit semester course. You take that number of credits times the 3 contact hours or activity hours, that's a standard estimate, times the number of weeks, thus giving you 135 activity hours. Divide that by 40. Again, this is a GISCI standard where 1 course points is 40 documented activity hours, and you come up with 3.375 points. So you can use that type of formula approach for any submission towards the application. This is the part where the reviewers of the application are evaluating what you're putting in there to decide, is this credible or is it not? But the math is pretty straightforward. Continuing education classes, and this is where your RISA workshops can really do well for you. But by the way, you are getting that right now. So you should be documenting something right now. If you're working towards your GISP, you're sitting in a workshop at present, or you're sitting in a webinar. So the number of hours in class, you're going to have 5, I believe, at the end of this, 5.5, 6. Divide that by 40 and you get your GISCI points. So most workshops that your RISA offers are either a half day, which would give you 4 divided by 40, or a full day in length. So you get credit towards your GISCI points requirements by putting that into the formula and documenting it. Now, make no mistake, you do have to have that documentation. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But when you go to those conferences and you complete your requirements and you walk out of there with a certificate, you don't want to throw that in the trash can. You want to hold on to that, make sure you're maintaining it, because you're going to need it. Your word alone is important and certainly worthy, but it's not suitable or sufficient for credential pursuit. Conference attendance is also important. So next time you show up, and I'm hoping you all do, at the GIS Pro conference or another ERISA conference or any other GIS related conference, you're going to get some credit for that. So there's a set value of 0.1 per every day of the conference that you attended. So most ERISA conferences are at least a couple of days in length. So take that 2.5 days for this hypothetical conference, multiply it times 0.1, and you got yourself 0.25 GISCI points. Now, I'm going to pause here and just acknowledge something that I think is somewhat obvious and perhaps the root of some of the questions that originated that suggest a bit of frustration, and I understand this, for those that are grandfathered in on the GISP versus those that have proven themselves via an exam. I'm an academic. I teach at Indiana University. I require my students to take exams to prove competence. But I also really enforce to my students that there's an ethics requirement. Tripp mentioned this concept of GIS ethics. It is watched, and as professionals, we do have an obligation. If we're filling in this application, if you showed up for the first 10 minutes, maybe you showed up to get breakfast at the conference and then you took off and went sightseeing, I would hope that you would not be putting that day of the conference participation on your application. One hopes you would not be able to sleep at night for doing such things. We have a profession, and a profession is defined in part by the ethics that is under its foundation. So, yes, there is room for fibbing, but I would certainly hope that would not be something that any of us would do. And that's just my own personal observation, but I think it's an important one because, as you can see, there's room to sneak through points here. If you decide to do that within limits. And that brings us again back to that documentation component. So your credential points have got to be supported. Make sure you're keeping track of that diploma. Photocopy it. This should be something that you definitely maintain, that you keep in your close personal possession and work with that. The comment was made earlier, do you have to have an official transcript? And Wendy indicated that indeed that requirement had been relaxed. But, you definitely still have to have the documentation. Course syllabi are not a bad thing. And the reason that I recommend that is because a course syllabus, a course title does not always, and I'm speaking as someone who teaches at a university, in addition to being a practitioner, a course title does not by itself necessarily suggest the course content. So if a GISP application reviewer like Tripp is looking at the content of that and they're just not sure if that course title really fits the definition of something that you're claiming in terms of points, having that syllabi could really sort of push that on through. Tripp's suggestion, and I agree with this, is submit more points than you definitely need to cover your bases, but if you want to really cover your bases, provide the documentation. You do not have to have a documentation for conference points. Again, this is somewhat the honor system, but nonetheless, it is encouraged in case any questions arise. I know some individuals, and this was not directly related to the GISP, but in a hire I was doing a few years ago, I found out that someone that had said they'd been to an event, in fact, had not. These types of things do tend to catch up with you. So you don't have to have the documentation for the conference points, but again, it's most definitely encouraged that you go that direction. So this is a very short section. What I'm going to do now is turn this back over to my colleague Tripp, and he'll talk about experience requirements. Wendy, I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording, but while I do that, maybe there's a question or two. If so, we can address that.
And so that's a GISP A or AP, anyway, certification. So.
Tripp, a couple of folks have asked how you keep documentation for conference attendance. Scanned files, a physical portfolio, conference badges, receipts. What do you recommend?
I recommend keep it easy. So a receipt of attendance or a name badge is sufficient for saying you attended the conference. And conferences are special because you can double dip. Right, so you get attendance for being there, you get education points, but if you're also there and you present, as we'll talk about a little bit later, you get professional contribution points. So for that, you also need like a program or something that shows you were a presenter for that.
Okay, and then Willie had one more question. If I get my UAV pilot's license for survey, does that course count toward the education points?
My personal opinion would be yes, because that's part of field data collection, which is under the realm of GIS. That would be but I don't know what the official GISCI word would be on that. And that's the course would count potentially the license itself. So having another certificate license doesn't count as points on there. Somebody did say, I saw another question about education talking about if you don't get your degree, can you still count points? Yes, because you get points for a degree, plus you get points for any GIS related course you took towards that degree or under that program. So even if you don't get your degree, and I'm a good example of that, I never finished my degree either, but I was able to count all of my coursework that I did while in college towards the education. So, and that included things like introduction to surveying, engineering graphics was basically drafting courses, as well as introduction to programming and some other things like that, not just the GIS courses, because when I went through, they didn't have just GIS courses. But anyway.
All righty. Well, take it away, Carrie.
All right. Thank you all for being here. I apologize for my tardiness and wasn't here at the beginning, but we're going to talk about experience and requirements and documentation. And just to go back to a point that was made earlier by Tripp about keeping receipts, keeping name tags. I know that I have in my file folder system just a folder that is GISP renewals, excuse me, that after every event, I don't keep the name tag in lanyard. I tend to recycle those, but I keep the name tag in that portfolio. As Tripp said, if you are speaking, I just keep all of the programs, or if it's a digital program, I'll download the page or two of the event that I was at and the time that I was speaking. It also makes it much easier for you to go back in and locate those for somebody that already has a GISP. Kevin, Tripp, and I all spend a lot of time at different conferences through our work, so it's easy to kind of let one of those slip or slide. But if you are moving forward, just go ahead and keep track of those. And there are often ways that you can go back and find that information moving forward. So now talking about experience requirements and documentation. The experience points come in 3 different tiers. This relates to basically your work experience, and experience is documented as either tier 1, which is an analyst, system designer, or a programmer. You get 25 points per year of experience in that particular tier. The next tier is data compilation, data maintenance, and teaching. For that, you get 15 points per year. And then tier 3 is a GIS user, where you get 10 points per year. Applications should include all 3 levels of experience. And it's important to understand that partial years can be calculated. So for any one of us, we typically are not doing the exact same task year in, year out, or you're bouncing between the different tiers within this system. So at times throughout a year, you might simply be a GIS user, somebody that is consuming GIS information. Other parts of the year, you're doing data compilation. Maybe you are teaching GIS to other users. And then another part of the year, you are doing system design or programming. So what you need to do is really break down your application by the amount of experience you have in each one of those based on the number of years of your experience. So if we look at experience tier 1, GIS analyst, system design, data development, and programming, this particular slide is taken directly from the downloadable core content on the GISCI page, and it gives you a good understanding of what typical tasks are in this tier 1. So if you're doing a needs assessment, application design and development, maybe doing some data acquisition, you know, you're running analyses using things like tessellation or vectorization or aggregation, those all count. This is actually referenced to the GIS system analyst and programmer, or the GIS analyst positions in the model job descriptions for GIS professionals. If you need to find that publication, it is available on the ERISA website. Tier 2 experience is, again, that data compilation, data maintenance. Maybe you're creating maps or you're teaching. So this is where you're typically going to get quite a bit of your experience, where you're editing data, you're doing data analysis and modeling. You are managing GIS layers. You might be doing things like training. You might be taking care of potentially some web applications. This all falls under tier 2 experience. And this really falls under the GIS technician and GIS specialist model job descriptions. Tier 3 is where you are a consumer of the data, as I like to say it. So you are doing technical support and troubleshooting. You may not be the person that is actually creating data, but you are somebody that is utilizing the GIS data, utilizing applications that involve geospatial technologies, or you're actually managing and coordinating GIS outside of the technical implementation. So this is not necessarily somebody that is managing data, but somebody that is a user of GIS information. So one of the ways that I always like to look at it from a GIS user description would be potentially somebody that works in your local courthouse that is a user of GIS technology, whether it is web-enabled or desktop, but they're not actually creating or maintaining any GIS information. In this particular area, the experience sample is, hey, it's Trip Corbin. He shows that he has 10 different entries. So in looking at this, in tier 1, percentage of his full-time job is about 15%. So he's going to calculate out the number of years of experience, 15% of those using the formula that is provided, and he gets 20 points per year, or 20.55 points per year. The duties, you actually fill out a little bit of the information about what exactly your duties are. In reviewing some of the portfolios, I have seen people put what their job description is. Some people have written their own descriptions of specific tasks and specific projects that they have worked on. For this particular example, tier 2, GIS technical or similar, 25% of full-time is spent 25% of his time is spent doing technical work. And again, the nice thing about the online formula, or the online format, is it does a lot of the math for you. I'm a fan of downloading the application and going through the math myself. This was kind of the long form that was done before we had the online application. I personally like to do it that way because it enables you to kind of see where you fall and then put it in the online component. Typically what would happen is you want to make sure that if you are doing GIS full-time, that your full-time equivalent under percentage matches to 100%. There is also the ability to have a supervisory bonus. There are those of us that have left the GIS practitioner world and are more in the GIS management world. So we're not necessarily working on doing data creation on a daily basis, but we're managing people that are. You get a 10-point per year bonus for managing people. And it might be a situation where you're managing a team of people for a short term. Say it is a 1-year project. You would get your 10 points bonus for that particular supervisory session. Pardon me. So the supervisory bonus is really designed for management level GIS professionals that are working less and less with the technology. It has to be added in addition to your other GIS experience, which means that you can't just put down that you are a GIS manager. That goes on top of all of the other experiences that you have. Anybody else suffering from allergies right now?
It's a tough season, Carrie. It's an Indiana thing.
I apologize. Okay. The next thing is you have to have a letter from your employer. It must be submitted with the application for review. And it only needs to be from your current employer. There are form letters available that you can fill out and have your employer sign, or they can write their own. Oh, pardon me. So the employer form is, or excuse me, the employer letter is required if you are not currently employed. I'm not really sure what you do about that, actually. Kevin, do you have a thought? Trip?
Go to your most recent employer.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, great.
The other option would be a client. Similarly, if you're self-employed, you've got to go to get a letter from a client that says your claims are correct.
So the next slide that we have is actually Trip's contact info, as opposed to mine, because he was going to cover this this section. So I'm going to open it up to questions at this point.
Wendy, do we have any questions for this section?
There have been a few. Somebody's asking about how do I document supervising interns? I've supervised one GIS intern during my current employment. Can that be addressed in my letter from my current employer?
I think absolutely. In fact, when I submitted my original packet, I believe I was supervising half a dozen interns at the time. Trip, do you agree?
I do. When you're going to claim the supervisory bonus in the online portal, you actually have to set up a separate job position, even though it matches to your existing job position to do that. So when you set that up, you could include the description of what you did as a supervisor. So between that and the letter, you should be covered.
The other thing to consider too, and this is me putting my academic hat on here, the term intern and part-time hourly are two very different things. Intern typically is an unpaid, or often is an unpaid position requiring some type of output for a class. Whereas an unpaid student, for example, or a paid student is what often many people call intern. So if you're supervising someone that is doing a task to fulfill a job as you would do it normally in a management role, I would differentiate between the two. Both are valuable, but they are different things.
But you still get the bonus.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, and somebody had asked that as well. Does managing interns count for the supervisory bonus?
Yeah, it's a good question.
It's important to remember too that when you're filling out the experience requirement, there are very few of us that do 100% of the time we are supervising. 100% of the time we are acting as a GIS specialist or analyst. Most of us, and I think this is one of the things that I like most about GIS is we wear many hats throughout any given day. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind that, you know, I manage somebody, but I'm not a full-time manager. I probably spend 20% of my time on the actual task of managing my employees. The rest of the time, I'm actually acting as a GIS analyst, or sometimes I'm a GIS user. It just depends on what I am doing on any given project. So I like to take kind of a year and break it down and say, yeah, maybe 20% of the time I was, I was doing GIS analyst work. Maybe 50% of the time I was I was acting in a role similar to a GIS technician. Maybe 20 or 30% of the time I was acting as a GIS user. And that's how I would break down my year. And then of course, multiply that out over the number of years of experience that I have had.
Okay, and another question regarding the letter from my employer. Currently, I'm a GIS analyst under the supervision of the IT director who does not have a great deal of GIS knowledge. Does this matter?
I would say no, because the person who signed my letter was a PE who didn't know anything about GIS. He could barely spell it. So it's really, the role of the letter is just to verify that what you're putting into the portfolio is indeed correct, and that when they hired you, they did some background checking so they know that anything you claim before you went to work for them is also true. Yeah, and that's the other point. I don't know if Carrie mentioned, is that you only need the letter from your current employer. You don't have to go back to every employer you've ever had. But your boss's GIS knowledge level is immaterial.
Got it. And how
That's
about,
actually a really good point.
do you put the dates as only the time you were supervising?
Yes.
Okay. I'm finding out the question. Somebody asked, when submitting your portfolio, if it gets kicked back, it needs to be resubmitted. Is there another fee required? And Katie quickly answered me, no fees if all we need is additional information. So that's helpful. And it looks like a few of the next questions are all about the contributions portion, which Linda is covering next.
We should point out that for the whole portfolio, the goal is not to exclude anybody that is indeed deserving of the certification. If we have some questions or if we deduct points and it puts you under the level, but you're still close, we're going to reach out to, and I'm saying this as a reviewer, we're going to reach out to you and ask for some clarification, try to better understand what you're saying, and not, our goal is not to fail anybody, is what I'm saying. So yeah, if you're close and we've deducted some points, we're going to work with you. If you're way off and it's just nowhere close, then you would have to probably resubmit. But I don't think I've ever seen that happen.
And Tripp, I think it's important to note as well that if you have to resubmit, you can ask the GISCI where it was that you had shortcomings, and they're typically very forthcoming in saying, you know what, you needed to to work on this area or that area. Your experience needed to be a little bit more detailed, things like that. I know both Tripp and I have worked as reviewers in the past, and that's an important note, is we do everything we can to ensure that people are going to be successful. This is not meant to be a process that is, well, we want as many people to be professionals as possible. So we're going to do everything we can to encourage and educate, which again is part of the reason why you're on this call today.
So to keep us somewhat on schedule, let's go ahead and Carrie, if you could stop your share, and Linda, if you could go ahead and share your screen, we'll get into our last slide deck.
As the others have mentioned, there are three components: experience, education, and contributions. When you get to the contribution section of your application, I want you to think about these not as contributions as much as professional activities. Because when you're out and you're doing things in the profession outside of your job, you're adding to the body of knowledge, and you're on for the professional body of knowledge, and you're doing it for the benefit of the community beyond your client. So the point there is these are things that you are not being paid to do. And that may be working through people, working through technologies, research and development on processes. It's a many-faceted category. Another thing to realize is this section is about developing your own professional skills. If you think about being on a conference committee or publishing a paper or working on a GIS Day event, you're developing those communication skills, you're developing your leadership skills, collaboration, organizational skills. So again, the well-rounded professional is what this application is looking for. I think we've said it many times, we're not looking for software operators, we're looking for professionals. So you'll see that the contributions are broken into 8 categories, and we'll go into those a little more detail in the next few slides. But I just wanted to give you an overview. What you will need, you need 8 points total for contributions. Documentation can include the actual publications if you published a journal article, or even a newsletter article. If you were, as we've mentioned earlier, if there is a conference and you're on the agenda, you can send in a PDF of the agenda page with your name on it. If you've received awards, you can copy those. And if there's an activity like GIS Day, just the activity schedule with your name on it. If you volunteered, if you have a thank you letter or any kind of correspondence with the organization. So it's pretty straightforward. I mean, think about what you have in hand or can get that best documents that activity. If you're not claiming if you're claiming 2 points or less, it does not require documentation. As we've said all along, if you think there's any questions or if it's handy, include it just to avoid questions and delays. So let's talk about these categories in a little bit more detail. The first category is publications, and this includes everything from publishing a book or an atlas to putting an article in your local regional GIS newsletter. And you'll see the point spread there. But, you know, if you do, if a paper is published, say, in the newsletter, you get 1 point. But if you've published it in a broader magazine or journal, that would be 3 points. I don't think we have too many conference proceedings anymore, but there was a day, my friends. The second category is professional organization points, and this is being an active participant in a professional organization. Examples of those, of course, we think GISCI is an awesome professional organization and highly encourage that you get all your contribution points through GISCI. But there are other organizations, if you're in the university environment, perhaps the UCGIS, if you're in state government, the National States GIS Council. The main point here, and this is something that you'll have to qualify, is it has to be a GIS-related organization. Now, if you're working through AICP or the National Society of Professional Surveyors, that's fine too, but you're going to have to include some explanation as to the GIS focus of it. In other words, if you're on the AICP GIS committee, that's great. So again, they're looking for geospatial organizations and GIS focus. So again, think through and think what those organizations are. Also, I should also mention, you can get your points in any one or multiple categories. So if you're not active in an organization, you don't do this section. So just for those people who have found this as a rewarding professional activity. All right, little confusion on the previous section. You get education points for attending a conference. You get contribution points for stepping up and contributing to the conference. So that means you're a conference chair, you're a committee member, or you're making a presentation or poster. So I hope that's clear. If you actually present at the conference, then that's going above and beyond just simply soaking up. You're not just there to soak up the information, you're giving back, again, as we said earlier, to that body of knowledge. And I've gone ahead and included another category here, and that's workshop instruction, because a lot of the workshop instruction is associated with our conferences. But if you're doing any kind of workshop instruction, that is a 3 point. So again, a great opportunity, and I hope you see how these activities encourage people to show up at meetings, lead workshops, and things like, you know, Kevin and, you know, you guys are getting points today, but guess what? Kevin and Mickey, Kevin and Trip, we're all getting points too for leading this workshop. GIS awards. You get a national award, that's 3 points. So go and put in your applications for those leadership awards and your GISCI local government awards. And if you get a local regional award, that's worth 2 points. And again, that's as simple as simply copying the notification or the actual award and including it in your portfolio. GIS volunteer, I want to qualify this a little bit with the other. Generally, this is helping with existing events or activities. A great option, as we all know, is GIS Core. And volunteering with one of their missions, you get ½ point per day. But if you're just doing simple volunteer work, like maybe you're working at your, going into your local library, they have a GIS, maybe they have a GIS day or GIS activities and you're working on an hourly basis. That's fine. And then we have the other, and this is really the outside the box stuff. This is where you create your own event and activity. You might organize a GIS Day event. You might be a participant in an event like that, or other related community activities. Those are 1 to 3 points, and you need to explain them. And you can use the previous hourly contributions to do that. And I want to spend a little time on volunteering and other, because this is really an opportunity to step up and do what you enjoy. think outside the box. I know that Kevin and I have both worked as merit badge counselors in our cases for the Boy Scouts on GIS related. They actually have a GIS badge now. They may in the Girl Scouts as well. GIS Corps, we know. If you're going out and doing water quality collection and inputting the data for your local government, again, if you're not being paid for these are things that you do outside of your job. Going into the schools, as I said, working with the librarians, doing a community map-a-thon. This is an opportunity to have fun with your profession, to promote your profession, and to engage others in geospatial data and information. And really, I want you to think of this as an opportunity because I have gotten far more from this, and I know most of the others on the call have as well. It's very rewarding. Really don't have a lot more. If you want some detailed explanation about the various things, you'll see that at the GISCI.org, they actually have a step-by-step guide to completing an application, and they have one on contributions, and they have one on education and experience as well, but you'll find it at that site. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
And so, Wendy, is there any questions specific to this section?
Sorry, I was just replying to one. Somebody asked if there's a difference between regional and national or international membership for contribution points, and that answer is no.
Correct.
Trip has answered a few along the way here. A lot of questions about presenting as part of your job, where you get paid for it rather than, just providing a presentation. Is there any helpful hints about that?
Technically, that's not a contribution. I'll have to. Any of the others want to weigh in? I mean, it's always been things that you weren't paid to do, because if you're doing it as your job, then you're doing that as your job.
Agreed.
But also think about it. If your employer sends you to a conference and you go to that conference and you're going there to get the information, and you step up and also do a presentation in addition to going to get information, then that is, that is stepping up beyond your job.
It really depends on if it's outside of the scope of your normal job duties, is the way I differentiate it.
Yeah, that's a good way.
If you're a GIS analyst, but then they send you to a conference to present on a specific project, that's outside of your normal job duties. And so, yes, it should count. If you're a salesperson going to a conference to give a pitch about your product, that can't count because that's part of your job duties.
Right.
Oh, here's a good one. If I give a talk at a school about my profession through my work, does that count?
Absolutely, and please go do that.
Absolutely right. Christina, I saw one from Christina, way up there. If I made a poster for GIS Day, does that count as a conference poster?
This is all, let me go up. If you make a poster for an event,
Keep going.
I would almost consider that volunteer work, but it doesn't matter. You're getting contribution points regardless.
Mm-hmm.
If you present it and you've got proof you presented it and the public saw it and it helped enhance the GIS profession in some way, you can count it.
Yeah, I think the important thing that Linda's really trying to get across here is participate. Get out and become involved. That doesn't mean that you have to be the one leading a chapter or things like that, but make sure that you are being part of the community. If you work a 9-to-5 job and then just go home every day and don't participate outside of your job, you're not really contributing to the profession. It's important that we give back as professionals, especially, those of us that are leading this call have been in the GIS profession for more than a year or two. And it's important that we give back. We do mentorship. We help guide future generations. And that's part of the reason why we are all on this call doing this type of participation.
Yeah, and if I could build on that, since we have a couple minutes. Well, actually, I'm going to go off script here a little bit. If anybody has a really unique activity they've done, contributions-wise, professional activities, I'd love for you to add it for the chat, because I'm always trying to sort of enlighten things that people don't think about, like going in and talking about GIS at your school.
Linda, I'm going to take your lead and go a little off script too. I would be negligent by not taking the opportunity to directly connect what we're talking about to an opportunity that I hope everyone does take advantage of. There's a couple things I want to point out that have happened this afternoon. If you did not notice this has been a tremendous tag team effort. You've had 4 presenters who I hope you agree worked very well together, who were responding to questions even while someone else was presenting, who were engaging and interacting. This is my experience in ERISA. It's the reason I'm engaged in communities or committees. It's the reason that I am doing what I'm doing today. So we're talking about you having to do things to get points. Folks, this isn't about you doing things to get points. We're all doing this because we get something from it on a personal basis. If there was no GISP, we'd still do this because we're getting every bit as much as we gain, if not more. Biggest mistake I made in my career, quite frankly, is I waited 10 years to figure it out, and I've never turned back from that point on. I would also invite you, if you're not sure how to get involved, that is not a problem. All that you have to do is reach out to any one of us or just shoot an email off to Wendy at ERISA. We'll get you engaged. For this particular webinar, we put out a call for volunteers. I'm thrilled to say we got over 24 people that reached out, and I'm pretty sure we put the vast majority of them to work looking at this content, looking at this material, providing insights and input, and as a result, we've been able to do what we've done. The other thing that I would invite you to do, if you found value in what you've seen so far in this webinar, this is the first half, tomorrow is the second, I would invite you to share with us what other kinds of educational offerings that ERISA could do to help you grow as a GIS professional. And I will promise you that we'll take a good hard look at that and try to fulfill that need. And if you want to get involved in it, by all means, just let us know. We'll bring you right to the table.
Kevin, I want to jump in. One of the questions I saw flying back and forth was about the being a member of ERISA International and being a member of a chapter and how they count. They count equally in that you get 1 point for every year you're a member of ERISA International, and you get 1 point per year for being a member of the chapter currently, because they are still separate but linked organizations. Once you become, or once the one ERISA model that's being worked on is implemented, then that might change. And that's something we have to look at from a board's perspective going forward. But yeah, you get 1 point for being a member of ERISA International and 1 point per each chapter you're a member of is contribution points.
Yeah, and Trip, I think it's a good thing to point out as well that when you are filling out your application, if you are a member of a local ERISA chapter, I'll use Georgia ERISA because I know that you're a member of that one, Trip. You would mark down that you are a member of Georgia ERISA, not ERISA International at this point.
Unless
so
you were
sure
a member of both.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, and as the other question was, I saw come up, was about how long, to be able to count it, you have to be a member for at least 6 months before you can count that as being a member for that year.
I see a question I would like to reply to. Kelly wrote, I have established the first ever Women in GIS sessions at the Ohio GIS conference. And you're telling me that my dedication to diversity doesn't count? I'm not sure how you heard that, Kelly. If you are, I would consider that conference planning committee. So in addition to attending the conference, you're getting points for helping to plan the conference. So no, 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 it absolutely counts.
So Linda, her response was she's getting paid to do it. So does that eliminate it?
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah, it just popped up.
Well, yeah, that's your job. And I
So,
want to.
wait, the question is that I've got back to Kelly is your employer paying you to present on Women in GIS, or are they just paying you to attend and present?
Exactly. So again,
Because that's where it gets a little bit gray.
yeah, Kelly, if you are being paid to attend the conference, then this is a separate thing. But if you're being, yeah. So I hope that clarifies.
Yeah, I think it counts.
Everybody wants to give you as much credit as we can, trust us. And I think
when in doubt, reach out to the GISCI and they'll give you the final word on anything, because everybody has unique
yeah, and I want
situations.
to back up Kevin's statement about, yeah, I've petitioned to have this section relabeled professional activities rather than contributions. As Kevin says, we don't see this as a philanthropic activity. We see it as a personal development activity, because you're becoming a professional. And that means more than running the software or showing up for your job every day. It means that you are becoming a professional person who is out there working in your industry. You're making presentations, you're coordinating, you're developing leadership skills, and that's what this section's about. And I'll stop preaching.
Well, actually, if I can jump in, just to answer Ben's question about how and why does getting paid to do these things not count. As Tripp mentioned earlier, if you are a salesperson that is going to an event and you are being paid to basically sell your product at an event, that's one thing. If you are being paid by your employer to attend an event and you are also speaking, that is different, because typically that is not part of your daily job duties as opposed to being a salesperson.
Carrie.
So I think that's where it gets a little gray.
And Carrie, regardless of whether you get paid or not, you get points, because we're only talking about this one part of the portfolio here. Remember, we already talked about professional experience where you also get points. So whether you get paid or not, you get points. It's just where you enter those points in the application.
Absolutely. Great point.
There was one other question about starting a GIS group and what category. I would consider that other, and I would herald your activities. So you'll get points for it.
So this looks like a terrific place to, we're right on schedule. This looks like a terrific last closing question. Will today's and tomorrow's sessions be available for download? The short answer is when I click stop recording in a minute, I'll know, but the intent is definitely for that to be the case. So this is one of the many benefits of URIS International membership, and we look to grow these kinds of resources in the future. This is the reason that I pose the challenge to everyone: drop in into the chat or send us an email if there's something else that you feel like you'd love to see URISA do for you and hopefully with you just to support your membership. Let us know. We try to imagine, as we did today, what the needs are. I think we hit it pretty well today, I'd like to think, based on the great comments. We've had nearly 100 comments in our chat room today. It's exciting. But give us ideas. We're there to work with you. And remember, we is you. So get involved. This is a good thing. Does anyone have any closing comments? Any of my colleagues that presented today?
One last question to answer, and that is no, there shouldn't be any fee to access these for URISA members. The key being URISA members. So that's what we're here to support, is the membership. So yeah, for URISA members, it'll be anyone else. I don't know that we've decided if we'll sell these to non-URISA folks or not, but this is all for URISA membership.
Well, I'd like to thank all the presenters today and encourage everyone to attend our session tomorrow. We have 6 excellent speakers talking about the 6 different knowledge areas. I've seen their materials and heard them present in the past. I think you are going to gain much from participating in tomorrow's session. So thank you everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend the webinar today, and I hope it was as beneficial to you as we had imagined. Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.